Okay, welcome to this workshop video where I'm going to take you through the process of utilizing the Blender project I've set up from my research to see if I can expedite and speed up my workflow going forwards, both in terms of lighting, compositing and rendering. So basically, from a previous research study I did early on in the process where I was looking at workflow analysis, I set up a Blender project with compositing nodes, lighting rig and shadow and light catcher. And basically what I've done is refine that, labeled that, and save that as a default Blender file. So it has a background image in it, it has a placeholder model with the textures included to test out the lighting setup. And the idea is then going forwards, when I set up any new composition, I can load in a new background image, realign the camera, rebalance the lighting using the things that are all set up, but all my compositing nodes will be set up ready to capture all that data and render it through and composite everything together. So this is the beauty of using nodes, and hopefully this is going to work as I go forwards. So this is a test of this system, and I'll make this Blender file available to all once I know it's working correctly. So this is the video of me testing this out. So what I have is, in keeping with the thematic drive of my project, I've been sourcing images that are definitively British and European in look. And this is not only to compare and contrast nicely with the technology that I'm going to be adding into these landscapes, but also to give it a definitive look and feel around that's recognizable and definitively British. So this is the Old Man of Store photograph, credited to David Burton. I've done a CC search within Flickr. And not only does this give me a good download of 833 by 4700, which is a nice resolution, but it also gives me all the camera data and lens data here. So this is something that I can help to match. I've also looked up this Pentax Optio W90 to find out the sensor size. I did a little search in Google sensor dimensions for that camera, and it gives us a 6.16mm sensor width. So this is all information that we can use to best match our shot. So as you can see, all the compositing nodes are all set up. I've labeled key areas like light wrap, so there's a sub set of nodes within that. Everything to do with edge matte in terms of edge blending is in there, and everything to do with shadows is in this section. There's also labeled nodes such as plate match for matching the contrast and brightness of the particular foreground object. There's a sharpening option if we want to sharpen, and that's it basically. So let's see what we can do with this. So let's load in a new background image. So the first thing we're going to do is, in our 3D view up here, we're going to load in a new background image. So I'm going to add image, open. I'm going to navigate to downloads where this image currently is, and select that image. There we go, it opens in the interface, and let's put its opacity of this image all the way up. And you can see our lighting is very different to what it needs to be. So also I am going to load that same image into our compositing node. So I've got my node view and I've got it on compositing with this layer symbol at the bottom. And I'm just going to load in the image by pressing on this arrow, and because I've already loaded this image in as a background image, I can load it into my compositing view, and we can see not everything is right. The light wrap is working and all that kind of stuff, but it doesn't look in keeping with the image that we have here. So let's see what we can do. We need to realign our camera. So let's get hold of our camera. Let's scroll all the way to the top and lock camera to view. So before we do this, let's set up our camera settings. So we know that this focal length was a 5mm lens. So let's put 5mm into there. And the sensor size, let's make that 6.1. There we go. And what we can do now, let's just turn our plane off, the little eye for our shadow catcher. And let's take it into solid mode so we can see our grid. And what we're going to do is lock camera to view is ticked. Make sure that's ticked when we're aligning our camera. And what we can do is align everything so we can see where we're positioning things. I'm just going to take the background transparency of my image down a bit so I can see my grid. You can see we can position this grid by using the middle mouse button to pivot, shift middle mouse button to track and pan, and we can just align this as best we can so it looks like it's sitting on that plane. So let's just untick, importantly, lock camera to view, and then zoom in and out just to see how well we've done. 0, so I'm looking through the camera. And that looks pretty well composited onto there. Just while we're that zoomed in, let's lock camera to view again and maybe just move it down a little bit. So the angle of this floor looks like we're sitting on this building here. So yeah, the floor looks like it's in perspective with the grass, look, so on and so forth. So let's unlock camera to view, so then we can just freely move around our scene. The default area light you'll see in the frame is right above everything, so I've left it there as a default right above. You could angle this depending on where the direction of light is in your background image, but because this is a uniformly very diffused lit image, this makes sense to just leave this very large area light. But let's come to the area light settings and let's make sure that its color is taken from the image itself. So let's look through our camera view now and turn on rendered, so we can see the impact of that lighting change. So we've changed the color temperature to basically match the color temperature of our image, and that's the quickest thing that I found. So we've created this big area light as like a sky lamp. Just give it a chance to catch up. With such a large area light, sometimes it can take a while, so once you've changed a value, to ripple on through. So there we go. I'm a little concerned because I've turned down the opacity of my background image. Doesn't make much sense. Okay, so that's that done. Let's now come to our ambient lighting here. And this seems far too bright here, so I'm going to change this down to, because this is a very low lit diffuse scene, I'm going to change this to about 1.8, something like that. And that seems a bit better. And let's make the ambient light our same light. Let's go for something like that. That looks more in keeping now. Maybe too dark there. Let's try 1.7. Okay, so that's making a bit more sense. I'm just not quite happy with my camera position now. So I'm just, with lock camera to view, I'm just going to position it on this area here, because sometimes, and then untick it again, so I leave it in that position. So let's turn our plane on, and our plane is not only a shadow catcher, but is there to bounce the coloured light from whatever ambient environment there is. So if I select the plane, come to its material, and you can just simply change its colour to match the ambient colours of the environment. So let's change it to that green. And you can see there's a lot less bounce light going onto our object now, so it might be worth us just putting up our ambient light value again. I'm going to colour pick. There we go. So we're getting the bounce green light from the environment, and we've got our lamp set up with the same colour as our environment, and I've left it at the default size, this big sky size, and this 2000 strength. You could increase that if you wanted to increase the light. So let's just press render now. My default render settings are 25% of the source resolution, and we matched the source, or did we? Let's double check. So let's come to our file and let's go to downloads, and you can just roll over the image that we're using, which is this one here. And if you're not quite sure, let's change our view to little tiles, and you can see the image here. If we roll over that, it says 8333 by 4700. So we need to change this to 8333 to 4700. Okay, so it's quite an important factor that we did that. And as you'll notice, when we render, depending on the percentage of our resolution we have set here, because I've put a scale node that is set to the render size, our compositing render will always scale according to what value we have here. So we don't, once we've got these right, we don't have to worry about every time we change this value. So this is looking about right. So let's go render image, and it'll render it based on all these settings that I've set. I've taken all the bouncers down to 2 and left diffuse at 1, look. Sampling is only 32. Once this lets me scroll down, I'll also scroll down and show you that performance, because I'm rendering off the CPU, I've set it to CPU because I think most people won't have a dedicated GPU, they'll have a CPU. So I'm rendering off the CPU to do this. This is all optimized for CPU rendering. As you can see, it's starting to render. If we scroll down, my performance, my tile size is set to 16 by 16. So 16 by 16 is the optimum for rendering via the CPU. And my start resolution is 128, which is double the default, which is a good value to have. And then we are simply rendering out. And also in layers, in my layers I've set up, I've also got denoising ticked on. So by default, the project has denoising, which means we can have a much lower sample rate of 32 for the render, but then it denoises that during the process, and you can see it denoising the tiles as we go through. So we're doing 25% of 833, so which is about 2K, just over 2K, which is by no means a low resolution if you're wondering. And it's rendering this fairly quickly based on these settings that we've got, especially considering we've got such a big area light and a world light. We're not using any HDRI lighting because I don't think that's really relevant at this point. If you can set up a good ambient world lighting and use an area light diligently, you can increase your render times without the need for HDRI lighting. If I was going to use an HDRI lighting, you'd have to optimize this a lot more. And once this is rendered through, we can just have a look at some of our nodes in our compositing tree, just to see what they all do. So it's important that you change this plane material to get that bounced, light, accurate, not only the particular hue, but also its level of saturation and value, because that can dictate how much light from our area light and our world lighting bounces back at our subject, and can increase your lighting accordingly if you don't get this colour quite right. But also this will be acting as the shadow catcher for all our shadows in the frame. There we go, that's rendered through. And we can see actually by matching all those lighting values, we're getting a good starting point for our values. So let's have a look. I'm going to set this to fit. If we want to zoom in and out of our compositing window, which this is, we can simply use the zoom control here. And if we keep finger on Alt whilst in the compositing window, we can click middle mouse button to kind of move around. Like so. We can see this is integrating quite well. Our shadows are falling on the floor. And we're getting a fairly seamless composite that matches quite well. So let's see what we can change and manipulate this. So firstly, the plate match, the thing that's dictating the brightness and contrast of our object. By default, I've set it at this kind of where I've brought down the white point by default and slightly lifted the black point ever so slightly and brought down the gamma. So if we were to delete this back to a default curve, let's let this compose, you can see the difference. So we could just look at this and think, right, actually these whites maybe seem a little bit too bright. So let's just bring the white point down a smudge. That'll just ripple through. So we're seeing our results up here. Our black point doesn't look far off. Actually, if we compare dark objects to dark things here, we just might need to just bring our black point in a bit. Too dark, so let's just take that back. It's a little bit too dark. Again, just to fine tune this curve, zoom right in if you want, or you could dial it in with this value here. That's taken our black point back to where it was. In fact, if we keep an eye on this, that does seem a bit darker than now. So maybe it was reading as lifted as before, as I had it before. So that's gone too far. Let's just take that down a smudge. Let's take that down to 0. So this is manipulating that black point currently, because we've got that dot selected. And if we compare like for like, this dark shadowy area around that point in the shot with this dark area, it's not quite dark enough. It's 0.01. Let's try 0.005. And that gives us quite a nice value. So there we go. And our white point doesn't look far off. Gives it kind of contrast. Atmospheric perspective would tell us that it's further away. It would dissipate its contrast. But if we compare it to bright things in the frame around that point, you know, visually they seem about right. So that looks nice. So let's move on to other things that we can control. So let's come to our light wrap setting here. So these nodes here, if you press tab key while selected, it opens up all the sub nodes. And what you can see in here is all the nodes that are dictating this setup. And by default, I've got the Node Wrangler add-on installed. If you haven't got that installed or it doesn't ripple through in my project, simply come to User Preferences, Add-ons, type in Node Wrangler and tick this on. And this allows you to Control-Shift-click on any node to see what it looks like at that point in this window. Look, so we can see, so if we Alt middle click just to move around our view in our compositing view, you can see basically what's happening is this curves adjustment is saying how much the light wrap is going to take effect. So where it's white in this matte is saying where the light wrap is going to be most prominent, and then where it fades towards black, this is where there's going to be no light wrap at all. So if we look at the results here, if I was to pull this down in the other direction, you'll see the change in our shot just there. So what we can do is just use this RGB curves just to control the contrast of the light wrap to get it just as we see fit. And if we lift it really high, it's all going to be light wrap, which doesn't quite ring true. So we can make a decision as to where we want this. That looks quite nice the way it is. The other thing, this is defining the contrast in the matte, but the level of this, the impact that this is having is controlled by this multiply. So you could just leave this RGB curves alone and then just dial in how much effect you want this to have with this control. So if you type in 1, that means it's fully on. We'll see that effect. If we go to 0, it's fully off. It has no light wrap at all. So if we go to 0.5, we've got half and half. 0.4, which is where I think we were before. Again, that's given us a nice mimic. So it's a combination of this multiply effect, and I'm just going to label that control. We'll call this wrap. So we can balance basically our settings with how much we want this to have an impact. So far, I think 0.4 is about right. We could push this a little bit further. Like so. And that starts to look quite in keeping with the environment. Not bad at all. Okay, so it's a combination of this effect here with this control down here. And that's how the light wrap functions. So we can just tab out of this, and that's the light wrap done. We've also done our plate matching. The edge blend I would leave alone, because that's just blending in the edges of the matte. So if you would see that, it's created this white matte, which is then working with a blur to just blend the very edges, similar to how the edges blend in the natural environment. So that's what that's doing. If you find you're losing too much fine detail, say of these things just here, then it might be that you actually make this slightly smaller. So these blur values just here are the things that are really are dictating how wide this blur is. So you can see as we take them down, makes it much tighter, and this one here. But let's return those back to normal. So these were all one. That was just to soften the edge of that matte. I mean, you can change these a little bit more if you wanted to. So we can come in, say if we increased that, say to 4, what you get is this roll off of the edge blur. But it does mean you can lose a bit of detail if you're careful. Too much softening at the edges. If we bring this down to 2, and you can see what it's doing, it's kind of blurring the very fine lines, and we're losing the nice detail that we had originally in the image. So it's just good to have these down, the default values. Preserve your edge detail. So there we go. And if we come to the multiply control here, this can dictate how kind of the blur works. And if we were to tab out, so here's the edge matte, which is then feeding into where the object and its background is composited with a blurred version of the background. So that's coming in just here. If you wanted to control the amount of edge blur there is around the edges, you could dial this back. So let's keep an eye on this. So let's take this to 5 and 5. And you can possibly bring more of your edge detail back that way. So let's try 2, 2. We've brought a lot more of our detail back, which is nice to see, but we're still getting some blending. And often this value is dictated by how far away your object is, how small it is in the frame. Because if it's further away, you're going to need less edge blur. So we'll label this. We'll come to the node options on the right hand side. Edge blur amount. And we can give it a color so it stands out. So anything that really you think is worth standing out, we can give that a standout value. So if we look at this now, we have got some edge blur there, but we've revealed some of our stuff coming back. That's coupled with our light wrap. And so on and so forth. So again, if you feel like the edge blur is just really not needed, you can dial this back completely. Or just a tiny bit of edge blur is worth having. Just to take those staccato edges off. Okay, so they're the major controls. So we've got light wrap, edge blur, and we've got the plate matching function. If we felt there was a need to add some camera blur at this point, then what I often do is, as much as we've got a sharpen option here, so if we put the sharpening up, you'll see the render sharpen up. So that's there if you really need to compare it with a very sharp image. But what we can also do is we could either use the soften value. So let's try 0.1. If you want to put it up, we can see it working. You see it softens the shot. So that can work quite nicely to match your values in your background plate. Okay, so there we go. There's our shot fairly well matched. I think we just need to come back and maybe just tweak the plate matching. So I'm going to give this a color to make it stand out. And maybe we just need to pull down this mid-tone slightly. I think that matches a lot better in terms of its environment. Go a step further. That makes more sense. So there we go. So there's how to manipulate this node setup to get the best possible matching. So I haven't had to build any of this node tree. It's all pre-set up. This model is in there with its textures as a good placeholder. There is also a cube in here. So if we wanted to see the cube, let's come out of our render view into our 3D view. So if you just wanted to see a standard cube in there, you're welcome to. I've turned that off by default in both the viewport with the eye and the camera setting, so it doesn't appear in renders either. But if you just want a standard cube, you can drop one in. And sometimes that can help. I'll just wait for my preview to catch up. But what this has done is successfully allowed me to go from shot to shot. Let's put this on 0.5, so it's exactly 50% grey. And it allows me to go from shot to shot and just quickly load in a new image, match the lighting, match the light wrap, match the plate, focus, all those kind of things with a pre-built node setup, as you can see here. And it means that I can also share this, hopefully, with different users so they can just drop their own footage in and see how well it works. So I'm just going to do one last render with our cube in there. And as you can see as well, with those render settings, we're getting fairly good results by using denoising and knocking sample values right down, but yet letting the denoiser kind of pick up the slack. So this should on last count take about 2 minutes, and that's what it took last time. So we'll wait for it to come through. There it is, rendering very quickly, look, off the CPU. And our cube is sat there. So the way that I've set up the render layers, it renders the first pass, which is the objects, the floor, the bounce color, so whatever objects are in the scene. And then the second pass renders out the floor on its own. Then in the compositing nodes, it's set up such The floor is then combined with the foreground nodes and then they extract from one another to leave the shadows on the floor but not the floor, but you also get the impact of its bounce lighting on the object. So there's the second one, and this is the ground. And this is so the ground can be subtracted from the first render layer, which then says subtract me from myself, so it gets rid of the ground but keeps everything else, the shadows, the foreground. So if this works in this last render, this should hopefully prove to myself, but also for those that would wish to use it, that this setup with all the compositing nodes intact, by labeling and combining things into node trees, I've got something that I can manipulate and use throughout whatever project I want. I just match the camera settings, match the background image in both the compositor and in the viewport, realign my placeholder objects and the camera to match the scene, and it means that then subsequently I can import any object into this scene and it should be lit and match accordingly. So this should hopefully speed up my workflow going forwards. And there we go, there's the final render. And because I've got the node wrangler on, it's still showing me a previous node here. So if I just Control Shift click on the last node here, I should see it in this viewport as well. And there we go. A nice interpretation of the scene. And for some reason I'm not seeing my cube. So we need to figure out why that is. So let's just come out. Could be that the cube is on the wrong layer. No, it is. So I wonder where that cube is gone. It's not there. It's not there. There's the image. There's the render layers. There's the cube still. Actually, let's change this to fit so I'll see what I'm doing. There's our cube. And somewhere in that point it's not mixed together correctly. So why is that? So could be that the object index of the cube is incorrect. So you'll notice the bot has an object index of 1. So let's make sure the cube has an object index of 1, 2. There we go. So fingers crossed if I render this again, because the object indexes, this pass index, are what dictating whether it's seen in the final render or not. So when I combine the shadows with the object, that's what we're seeing. So that's why it seems I hadn't ticked that off, so that's worth knowing. So any object that you bring into the scene needs to have an object pass index of 1 in this setting here, and it needs to be imported to the first most layer in the Blender layers. So I'll let this render through. It's amazing how quick that renders through that bot with all those textures coming from Substance Painter. And by the way, this the model has been set up using the new principled shader. So if we go on the bot here, you'll notice that we're using the principled BSDF, which allows us to simply plug in the 4 major image textures that are exported by default from Substance Painter, or Substance Designer for that matter. So hopefully this pass index change in the object settings for the cube should hopefully pass that through on the correct pass index. because the pass indexes are what we're using, as you'll see up here. Index 1, that's what we're using to kind of separate the objects from their background plane. So fingers crossed that should do the job. And it'd be interesting to see then the light wrap affecting the cube as well, and see if it all ripples through. Because if it does, that tests that this workflow does work as it should, or as hoped. It means I can simply drop objects in, put the correct pass index on, and it means I can just simply share this project with others. There we go, fantastic. So that's proved it was that problem there. The cube has got the same light wrap, it's casting the shadows. And if we just press on the end of the chain in my compositing nodes, that should also prove that all is well. Just wait for my scene to load through. So let's go to the last node, Control Shift and left click. That'll just ripple that same change through into this, and there we go. Fantastic. So there we go, there's proof that this workflow works. This is something I can take forward to all shots, change the background image, test it out with my placeholder models, and then bring new models into this first layer. So when I import models in, I need to make sure that only this layer here is selected when I import them in, and I make sure that the object I bring in has the pass index of 1. And then when I come to render, I need to make sure I shift click both of these layers so they're both on, in order to render out both the foreground objects that I've brought in on that first orange dot layer there, and also the second layer which has just the plane on it if I click on its own and the light. So this has got the objects, this has got the plane. Shift click both to render out effectively. And there we go. So that's how it all works. Thank you.